This is Jay Ing from Vancouver, BC, and you're listening to the Two Broads Talking Politics podcast, where two Midwest moms talk progressive politics and political activism with expert guests.
Hi everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, and I'm here in this episode with Adina Robb Dershowitz, who is the author of a children's book called Women Who March. Hi Adina.
Hi Kelly, thanks for having me.
Let's start with just a little description of the book. Can you tell us just a little bit about what kind of book is it and sort of what happens in the book?
Sure. So Women Who March is a reflection of my own experience participating in the 2017 Women's March in Washington, D.C. It's really intended to start conversations between parents and children about what the march was, why we felt there was a need to march, what kind of activism was taking place. And then there's a call to action towards the end of the book about how children can get engaged in their own types of activism through whatever their talents or interests might be. So it's not intended to be an exhaustive historical document by any stretch. It's a reflection of my own experience with a little sprinkle of inspiration towards the end.
Is this the first book that you've written? Is this something you've done before?
This is my first book. It's not something I've done before. It was kind of the way that I thought I could contribute to this movement. I'm an educator by profession, and I've always felt that children deserve an understanding of what's happening around them in a developmentally appropriate way.
And so before you went to the march in D.C., were you very politically involved? Had you gone to other marches? What was your background going into that?
I had gone to other marches. I had been somewhat of probably a social media activist. I had occasionally written or phone banked or emailed, but it was rare. I think the 2016 election for a lot of us ignited a fire, but also a concern that became very real. So that changed my whole outlook on how urgent things were. And I also think having my children changed the level of urgency for involvement. I think as a young professional, as a college student, I was very passionate, but I don't know if I necessarily felt that I had a direction for that passion or an urgency.
Yeah, I definitely felt that more having kids. And so your kids are then fairly young?
They're two. I have 2-year-old twins, one boy and one girl.
Well, that's fun in and of itself.
Yes, it's an adventure. And I was actually very, very, very torn about going to the march because they were about 10 months old, and I was really going back and forth up until a few days before about kind of what the right thing was to do as a mom. Was it better to stay and kind of watch it from afar and participate in my home life with my children? Or was it better to get on a train and head down to Washington and make my voice heard? And I think both decisions are equally valid. I just made the choice that seemed right for me, which was that I felt in my heart that I needed to be there. So, and luckily, and I know it's a great privilege to have had the ability to have a supportive partner who was able to stay with the children. I was able to make travel arrangements. All of these things I'm very grateful for. But it was definitely that tough question of what's the best way to advocate for my children, myself, in that situation when they're competing needs at the same time.
What's the process look like for writing a kid's book, or what did it look like for you? Where did you kind of start with it, and how did you get to a fully fleshed out book?
The idea came from actually when I came back from the Women's March. I always, even when my kids were infants, would just talk to them and babble about my day or where I was or what was happening. And so I was kind of trying to explain to them where mom was the day before, and I started talking about the march. And that's when I realized, this is something that I think is going to be a difficult conversation with parents and kids, and maybe having a tool would be able to start that conversation. So then from there, it really became kind of outlining stanzas and topics and ideas. And it was all, for me, almost all written on my commute to and from work on my phone, because that was the time that I had. And so I was just writing and then eventually rewriting and sending it to people and getting feedback as far as the actual text. And then a lot of time passed, after at least my first real draft. And I thought, how am I going to get the illustrations? Because that to me was what was going to really bring it alive. And through the recommendation of a friend, I found a freelancer site, and I connected with Heather, who is an illustrator from Michigan, and she and I collaborated completely online, again, a lot during my commute, back and forth with how this was going to look. And she really was the one who brought it into existence in terms of making the story something more than just obviously words on a page. And then the bigger question became, how the heck do I publish this thing? Mm-hmm. Because this was not something I'd done before. And it seemed like there were two roads. One was go the agency route and the publisher route, and the other was to try and self-publish, which luckily I do have some friends who've done that. So I kind of got their feedback and went through CreateSpace and Ingram Spark, which are two common self-publishing venues. And I think there are benefits to both going the agency and publishing house route and the independent route. But for me, I think I didn't want to wait a whole ton of time to get it out because I thought the moment would pass. And then also I didn't really feel comfortable in tailoring it so much for the marketing purposes. I really wanted to be authentic to my experience.
Mm-hmm. I should point out, for people who haven't read it yet, it's all written in rhyme in these stanzas, which is really fun. When you're reading it, I read it out loud to my sons today, and it was a lot of fun to read it. And the illustrations are just, they're so much fun. They're so vibrant. The colors are really vibrant, which, having been to a march, I was at the march in Chicago. That's what going to a march is like. The colors are really vibrant, and there's so many different people, and they're wearing different colors, and their signs are colorful. And so it really does sort of feel like you're there.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We did a lot of conceptual collaboration. I have no artistic skill, but I was really insistent on a few things. One being that the characters in the story were as diverse as possible. So in any way that we could visually display diversity, obviously there are a lot of non-visual elements of diversity, but we wanted to use as many visual cues for race, religion, ability, sexual orientation when possible. And we really I felt that it was really important to include different ages and things like that. And Heather was incredibly accommodating to all that, as well as trying to put in a couple of prominent people who were at the march. So there are some lawmakers, Senator Duckworth, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Harris. So trying to give authenticity to what happened, but also represent the true plethora of different types of people that were in attendance.
Yeah, and that's really exciting. And I think that, that too is very authentic to the experience of seeing so many different kinds of people at any march, I think, but especially these kind of political marches in big cities, you're very likely to see a very wide range of people. And so that felt very true in reading it. I think the other thing that was fun for my older son is 6, and he went to the Women's March in Chicago with me, actually both years. And so he had flipped through it before I was reading it to them, and he kept saying, he was like, "Oh, Mommy, these are like the hats you knit. This looks like," and I was like, "Uh-huh." He's like, "We saw signs like this." And I was like, yes, in fact, we did. So for him, it was sort of like nostalgic that he was remembering really the experience of being at the march. So I think that's good too. And that's another way that it helps sort of inspire a conversation.
I think also what's tricky is that not all of the parents who were at the march had children who were old enough to even have that conversation, to have memories from the experience. So the fact that this hopefully will provide some opportunity for parents to have the conversation with children who both were old enough and those that who are not yet old enough to understand. So when the people who did march can look back on the experience with their children, they can explain, what the significance is of different symbols or different places or different signs. Because, for instance, my children were obviously much, much, much too young, and even if I had brought them, there would have been no understanding of what happened. But and still they say girl power when we read the book, but they don't quite have an understanding of what everything looks like. So I hope one day that that's one experience I can share with them through the book, and I think other parents may feel the same way, or people who have young people in their lives or plan to have young people in their lives.
It is a very tricky thing to talk about. It was tricky then. It continues to be tricky. I'm sure I've told this story on the podcast before, but my 6-year-old was 5 at the time when we went to the march, and he was a fairly new reader, but he was reading everything that he saw. And so, of course, he was reading every sign that he saw that people were holding up. And he said, Mommy, why does that sign say, keep your tiny hands off my pussy? And I was like, okay, well, this is how I have to have the conversation about consent with my son.
Right.
And it was good. It was an important conversation that we had. And, it was valuable. But it's also really difficult to explain, this is because of something that your president said.
Yeah, we took our kids to the Women's March in New York the year following in 2018, and my husband said, oh my gosh, thank goodness the kids can't read yet. But I do think it's important to, when your kids do read, to have a frank conversation. Absolutely. And I would say in the construction of the book, one of the tensions that we faced was being authentic but being appropriate. So there are references to things like reproductive rights and racism and acceptance of all types of families, of course, but we also didn't get into all the political issues surrounding it. And frankly, our president is mentioned nowhere throughout the book. It really wasn't, to me, that this whole event was far greater than one person.
Well, and then it's also somewhat forward-looking. So, of course, the book is about an event in the past, but it leads to sort of a call to action for the future. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So the transition from the march to the call to action is really kind of what happened after every marcher returned from D.C., which is, I think, the feeling that really was rumbling around in my head as I traveled back, which was, okay, what do I do with this? I was part of this amazing event and surrounded by a lot of incredible people and ideas and thoughts. And well, what do I do with this? How do I make any difference? And I think that I came to this conclusion to write a book, but the idea is that you should tap into your own talents and your own desires. And that's the encouragement that I'm trying to direct children, is that find what ways that you can get involved in your community and ways that you can think about advancing our nation and our society, but in not necessarily big and daunting ways, just, asking questions when you read news stories, or reminding adults that there's an election coming up, or doing science and math. So there are so many different ways that children can express themselves and get involved in their own types of activism. And that's really what I am encouraging in the book.
That was another moment that my 6-year-old pointed out in the book. He said, Mommy, there's postcards to voters. We do that.
Yes, that was definitely intentional, because as a working mom, I found postcards to voters to be an incredible way to get involved with our democracy and elections at all levels. And I found it both incredibly empowering and incredibly accessible. So I asked Heather to include it deliberately.
And so Postcards to Voters is one of the organizations that you use the proceeds from the book to go toward. Can you talk about what you're doing with that?
Sure. So each month we identify a royalty recipient. So this book is completely a charity project. It's not something that I'm doing for profit. It's something that I'm doing to hopefully raise some funds and awareness for different organizations, as well as inspiring the conversations that we